no introductions in this crowd, the founder and executive director of Code for America, Jen Pahlka. Thank you so much. This is a really nice space to have an event, and it's graciously hosted by Cohen and a bunch of other people here at Thumbtack, and trust me, it's nicer here than our office, even though our office is lovely. They have better wine, thank you. But it's very gracious of you and to have your staff stay here late to accommodate our event. Thank you so much. So I know that a lot of you know Code for America because you all said hi on the way in, but I know some of you don't. So I just want to tell you a little bit about who we are. We're a national nonprofit that believes that government can work for the people and by the people in a digital age. What do we actually do? We help government serve the public better and help improve how public can improve government. You got that? Sort of two sides? Yes, thank you. Love the nodding heads. Much appreciated. Tonight, we're going to have a discussion about a part of our society that we really need to look at more critically. And it's very dear to me because when I received a copy of this book, Winners Take All, in Valley Forum, was that in May? It was back in May. And by the way, I thought it went to my husband, but Anand assures me that in fact it was addressed to both me and my husband, so I don't have to have like low self-esteem about that. I saw it and it was sort of intriguing to me, and I kind of picked it up and opened it, and it was like I could not stop reading the book. It came with some literature and some quotes from others who had a chance to read it before me, including Ajin Ku, who runs the Domestic Workers Alliance. And she said, this is the book we've been waiting for. And she was right. It really, really spoke to a lot of us who work in this field, the nonprofit field of philanthropy world, particularly for me, who think about the role of government and philanthropy and how we need to really reconsider the roles of these giant institutions, one of them, by the way, a lot bigger than the other, as we think about how we're going to get to a better world. Excuse me for a second. I know I'm breaking the live stream. Here, I know. So sorry. I'm giving you a close-up. Sorry. Don't know that. That's okay. Just got to like super close up your book. So just for example, you know, it's page 7, right, of the prologue of the book, and already he's saying, are we ready to hand over our future to the elite, one supposedly world-changing initiative at a time? Are we ready to call participatory democracy a failure and to declare these other private forms of change-making the new way forward? Is the decrepit state of American self-government an excuse to work around it and let it further atrophy? Or is meaningful democracy in which we all potentially have a voice worth fighting for? So if you know anything about Code for America, and you know anything about me and any of the people who work at Code for America, that is what we needed people to say. And I'm sure Jen had, you know, maybe a different part of the book that made her say this is the book that we've been waiting for, but that was the part that made me feel that way. And I sat there and basically read the book in 2 sittings, and then remembering that I had briefly met Anand before at the scene of the crime, yes, and Ideas Festival, I started stalking him on Twitter and trying to become his best friend. And it kind of, you know, he decided to be my friend, which is very sweet, and has graciously fit us into what is an incredibly busy schedule running around the country promoting this book. So please welcome Anand. Just gotta put all my stuff down. I don't want to read from the book anymore. You know the book by heart. I'm sorry to take your words. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here.
Yeah.
In this fancily named Thumbtack. Such a Silicon Valley name for something, Thumbtack.
It's a very successful business, and they do a lot of good for the world.
I know, yeah. Twitter, Square.
You're right at the heart of it. You're right at the heart of it.
In New York, we have names like Baker and McKenzie. That's totally different. It's like not.
You got some tech in here too.
Yeah.
You got some tech in here. He's from it. So let's talk for a second here. So we know like how much you can lecture the audience. Who here says feels like they work in tech? Okay, keep your hand up if you feel like you work in tech for good or civic tech or, okay, like everybody cut their hand up. Okay, so I don't know if the rest of you
All tech is for good.
we do like to say if there's a tech for good, what's the rest of tech?
Right.
But
The
there's
ISIS social media department, which is investing big in Silicon Valley, by the way.
yeah, well, I told him to be fun. This is going to be fun. So on like, well, actually, let me ask you another question. I'm not going to put you on the spot about whether you read the book tonight. A lot of you are here because you've heard about the book and you want to hear a little bit more about it, and then you're going to go home with the book. But who here has like heard an interview, read a review, and feel like they know a little bit about sort of the basic concepts in the book? Okay, a lot of you. So, but not everyone. So let's start with, why are you hating on philanthropy so much?
Great question.
What's wrong?
What is wrong with
That's
the
the thing
love
ever.
of man, the love of man? Which is what philanthropy is, the love of
Philanthropy.
man.
Oh, yeah,
And
right. Well, that
included
doesn't
in there,
even some of
but
us.
it was a long time ago, it was a different time. I think, for me, this germinated in a double-barreled observation that will ring true to anybody who's been alive in the last many years, which is that undeniably we live in a time in which rich people and privileged people and even oligarchs and plutocrats are incredibly generous, socially minded, obsessed with making the world a better place. And I argue in the book that we arguably live in the United States today under the most socially concerned elite in our history. If you just measure like the amount of money being given away, $410 billion last year, I think that dwarfs anything done in the past. If you look at the number of signatories to the Giving Pledge, but not just billionaires. Like I often talk about when you go to campuses, it's rare to find a 22-year-old who says, yeah, I just want to make a lot of money and go to Wall Street. Even the people who go to Wall Street feel a need to say, I'm doing this because I want to transform this. I want to fix Africa. I don't know where Africa is, but I'm going to fix it. Fix it.
So what's wrong? That sounds great.
I'm getting there. So all this elite concern and helpfulness sits uneasily alongside the second part of my double-barreled observation, which is that this is the most cruel economy for average people in 100 years. I think Piketty says that actually in history, this is basically a lot what America looked like right before 1929, which was a good year for Bordeaux, but not the economy.
Piketty fans in the audience?
Yeah, what?
Just saying who's Piketty fan. Yeah, we got a couple.
Buying the book doesn't count.
It's longer than your book.
I know. So, and then you just have all these numbers, which we hear all the time, but I'll just recite very quickly, which is half the country basically bypassed by economic growth since 1979. Okay? Now you can say that fast, but that's a fucking crime. If you actually understand what it takes, that's not a natural thing. That is a carefully rigged thing to make as much progress as has fallen on this country since 1979. The internet, genomics, personal computing, the phone, rockets. I mean, like, think of what has happened since 1979. The bottom half of this country didn't get a raise from that, on average. That's an astonishing fact. 82% of all new wealth created last year went to the global top 1%. The top 1% see their salaries last year grow 4 times the speed of 90% of Americans, bottom 90%. And so when you put these two facts next to each other, facts that we all know because we're here and we see things, the question is, what's the relationship between these two things? And so my problem with philanthropy, and it's not just philanthropy, but I'm also talking about other forms of elite helpfulness like social enterprise and give one, get one shoes and cupcakes that make a difference and et cetera, et cetera. CPGs, impact investing, I mean, the whole litany of these kind of elite market-based or market spoils-based efforts to change the world. The problem is either, in the best scenario, they're just doing nothing to actually arrest the fundamental trend of the age, which is those very same people actually grabbing more and more, right? If 82% of wealth last year was grabbed by the top 1%, it means that on balance, the philanthropic efforts are being outweighed by the grabbing efforts. But I started to become curious about a second question, which is whether it's not just that the helpfulness is not doing enough. It's not just that it's a drop in the bucket, which is obvious, but whether in fact the helpfulness was part and parcel of how the hoarding was upheld. In other words, whether the helpfulness was instrumental to maintaining the social arrangements that permit ongoing hoarding, and whether the giving was therefore a wingman to taking and the generosity a wingman to injustice. And the TLDR, after doing a couple of years of reporting, is, yeah. And we can talk about why tonight. But I think the unmistakable conclusion that I was led to, with not much pleasure, is that a lot of what passes for elite change in our time is in fact the defense of the status quo, masquerading as change. It is Tim Cook giving a moving speech about Silicon Valley needing to be regulated, companies other than his, social media companies, while not talking about the fact that Apple is a tax evader with $285 billion offshore. Not talking about how Mark Zuckerberg talks about community, creating community. We're here to create community. I love community. I may not like people, but I like community. And yet this company that talks so much about community, maybe the most idealistic large company in American history, also the first company in American history to allow an election to be compromised and perhaps tipped. So a lot of what passes for kindness, to my mind, is upholding a system that we can't, if we think clearly about it, defend. And a lot of that is upheld, in my view, by myths, by stories that we all casually believe, and therefore give the plutocrats kind of power. And I wrote the book because I believe that if we could see through those myths, a new path to change would come into view.
And so you were trying to make a new map for people to follow. And in that, what is the right role of philanthropy? And I gotta put a plug in for the thing that we cared deeply about is what's the right role for government?
Everything.
Wait, which question are you answering?
I think, there are, in this society, regardless of whether Donald Trump is president or Bernie Sanders is president or somebody in between, most of the activity in this country will always be in the private sector. Right? I don't think actually Bernie Sanders is calling for an America in which, airlines are state-run or you're getting your phone from...
I don't think that was part of the platform, yeah.
Right. The argument in this country is about where our common problems should be solved, right? So if we all agree our phones should be made privately and our air travel should be done privately and books should be published privately, you don't want the government controlling that. But when you have something like declining social mobility, which is one of the top 2 or 3 crises in this country, right? Basically, our self-image is, this is the place on earth where your effort most determines what happens to you, and it's actually the place where that's least true among the rich countries, right? The thing we think is our thing is we're actually the most non-thing. The American dream is literally least true in America among the rich countries. And the simple measure of that is like parents' income correlation with kids' income, and in America it's basically a perfect correlation.
We do like our data at Silicon Valley, so thank you for bringing data to the conversation.
You're welcome. And so on a problem like that, or a problem like how do you empower women, or on a problem like what do you do about the racial wealth gap, or on a problem like how do you fix education, those are the kinds of problems that I am bemoaning the kind of private conquest of. And you got charter schools in the education space. You got people telling women to lean in instead of giving them maternity leave. You have on the racial wealth gap, like these kind of ideas that kids can be empowered by creating one little pilot project here, one LeBron school or one Harlem Children's School zone, while you basically say nothing about the fact that the way we fund public education in this country is by allowing rich people to ring fence their property taxes into their own little community and achieve racial segregation and class segregation through this kind of loophole of class segregation. It's a system that no one can defend. It's not even conservative, it's not really just a dumb system. That is just a hoarding system. And I know a lot of rich people work on the education issue, but none of them work on that issue. Because that would do to the home prices in Marin and Westchester and Evanston and the nicer parts of Houston. It would take the home values down by 20–30%.
And maybe they just think it's not politically feasible because of it. But let's take for instance, charter schools. So the original idea of something like a charter school was that you go outside a system that is actually very hard to improve. Like let's talk about criticism of our public school system, right? And you create something that shows how better it could be, and then it influences the system itself. And so that idea has a history in philanthropy, right? Like you create something out of the system, but then it sort of flows back into the system. You feel that that's not working today, right?
People aren't doing that today.
Except, by the way, except at Code for America.
Right.
Where it works really well. But go ahead.
Part of what has happened, so when you think about Carnegie 100 years ago, some of the library deals he did, and this was when philanthropy was being invented. It wasn't a thing, and these guys were figuring it out and trying to get legal charters. And in some of the library deals, as far as I understand it, he built a library. And part of the contract with the local government was it had to pay for ongoing maintenance of the library. Not because he didn't have the money. He was trying to teach them a habit of doing something for their people that they should have been doing, but they weren't doing. It was a kind of new thing. And he was going to teach them to do it, and then, like, teach a kid to play piano and let them go. That approach has been forgotten.
It has not been forgotten. But
by and large.
By and large, yes.
Don't worry, I'm not
Yeah.
When you see so many of the philanthrocapitalists of our age, the entire theory is that they are entrepreneurial and smarter and brighter than government. And the ambition is to get out of government and stay out of it, and to build something over here. And they don't think about bringing it into government. The way Head Start, by contrast, was incubated at the University of Iowa Child Welfare Station in the middle of the 20th century. They tested it. They proved something that people didn't used to believe back then, which is sort of crazy, which is that if you take a kid from a bad background, but you give them a good environment, their fortunes improve. Shocking. But people didn't believe that in the middle of the 20th century, so they had to prove it. They did studies and they did academic work, but then they proved it. Take a kid bad background, improve the environment, improve the teachers, give them some love, they'd be fine. Now, if they were a philanthrocapitalist today, if they were a Mark Zuckerberg today, I think they would have just like maintained their own little program. Well, like Jeff Bezos built their own private network of schools on that philosophy, where the kid is a customer. I guess you can return your education after 2 weeks. What they did in contrast back then was that experiment remained a private experiment that became a public program called Head Start. You know how many people in the first class of Head Start? 500,000 people. And we always joke, these plutocrats always say they love scale, 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 scale. You know what has a lot of scale? The goddamn government. So the idea of philanthropy, I'm going to speak in a little local lexicon. The idea of philanthropy as a startup incubator for government programs, for government action, is a lost idea in many parts of this economy. Not everywhere, but in many parts of this economy. And I almost think about it, I think the concept of shame is very powerful, very important idea. I almost think of that kind of giving as being shaming the government to do what it should do, but wasn't doing for whatever reason. And the private thing is basically to say, I shouldn't be doing this. But you failed, so I am. Now, take it over from me.
So we have a positive framing on that. And certainly shaming is not always the wrong word to use. But we say we're showing what's possible. with government. And I think we learned this from lots of people before us in, sort of digital context. Folks like Carl Malmberg, who stood up the SEC database, put it online and said, everyone's using it, and then said like, oh, I'm gonna shut it down, because the SEC was like, we could never do that. And then we said he's gonna shut it down, the SEC said, oh, okay, great, we'll take it on. And now that exists, and it exists at a far lower cost, higher quality than they would have been able to do. He shamed them into doing what they should have done by putting these transactions online. And we followed that with things like improving the access to food stamps, where, when it takes up to an hour, 50 screens to sign up for food stamps, doesn't work on a mobile phone, but we can show that it will work on a mobile phone in 7 minutes. And now that's becoming the way the state of California is doing it. I think that is that in action. And where I'm going to push you, because I forgot to tell you that Anand both speaks to my heart and I agree with him in every single possible way fundamentally. I also disagree with him in some of the ways, because guess who funded that work? Folks like Reid Hoffman and Mark Zuckerberg, who say, yeah, actually government is scaled, and we are going to use this mechanism of showing what's possible, shaming government into doing it, and ultimately making government work the way it should. So I'll come back to
I think it only puts Mark 1% of his way to atoning for 2016, but but I'm glad he's taking that first step.
Well, there's a wonderful group of people at the Jan Zuckerberg Initiative who deeply know how government works and know are developing very sophisticated theories of how you change government, because this is not simple stuff, right?
But I think the thing that bothers me is when the rhetoric, when they were announcing their disease work, for example, at CCI, was, we're going to end all the diseases, right? Well, okay. Like, you couldn't fix the schools of Newark.
Right, but so here's the thing.
And Parker's hadn't been there.
Right.
But I just want to say, like, I'm sure, like, Columbus thought he was helping also. And one of the first philanthropists.
Can I get a glass of wine, please? I'm kidding. Oh no, I'm not. Thank you.
We're going to equalize this. That it's the tone and the attitude that to me suggests a disregard for the fact that we have a CDC. Yep. And to me, if you had his money, your announcement would not be, I'm going to get rid of all the diseases. Your announcement would be, I'm going to make the CDC so much better. And I think there's a real difference between those things.
So I mean, obviously, I come agree with it, but I think, the counter argument to that I really do want to lift up is, I'm going to thank you. Oh, good. Perfect. Take care of caretakers. Is that the CDC isn't saying that. We used to have a government that said, let's, put people on the moon, let's create universal education, let's create Social Security. These were big, bold goals that got people excited and rallied people together. And if the government isn't going to have those big, bold goals, somebody better. And maybe that's the other version of this.
Yes.
You got to shame the government for having big, bold goals.
However, we got to also do a little history. The government doesn't have enough resources because these people starved it of resources. The very same people who say they are filling the gap, they are stepping in for government that doesn't work.
So philanthropy is about $50 billion on social safety net issues, and government is basically 20 times that.
Correct. But since the 1970s, business interests in America, wealthy interests in America, have pushed for, prosecuted a war on government. That history, you can't have this conversation without talking about that history. They pushed a deregulation agenda, they pushed an anti-tax agenda, they made people making $8,000 a year in rural Mississippi think that taxes are hurting them. And they won. And if all of us in this room are living in their America, okay? Just the same way anybody who lived in America between the 1930s and the 1970s was living in FDR's America. So Nixon started the EPA. Why? Because he's a Republican, he's a conservative, he's a small government guy, but he's living in FDR's America. So you do it in a conservative way, but you're living in a, but we are all living in Reagan's America. And no one has ended it yet. Obama didn't end it, Clinton didn't end it. That's the era we're in. If Sanders had won, maybe that would be a new era, or, you know, but we're in the era that is defined by market fundamentalism, by the faith that money makes you smart and solves problems, et cetera, et cetera. And so the very interest, it's not always the same person, because some of these people are like 26 who have billions of dollars. But the same class of people who fought for the policies that led government to have less resources and be less capable. I'm not saying that explains all government decrepitude, but it explains some of it, and a lot of it. Those same people then show up, and I'm with them all the time, and they say, such a shame. And my favorite example, the government's not effective. My favorite example on earth is the great David Rubenstein, who you may know as a patriotic philanthropist. So such a nice thing to be. Two good things in one, like a win-win. So, David's a co-founder of the Carlyle Group, and big private equity firm, leveraged buyout firm, corporate waiters, depending on your, ideological persuasion. And his new thing is to buy stuff for the government. Government's so broke. He bought the Magna Carta, gave it to the government. He bought some things for Obama, the Oval Office, put it in the Oval Office because Obama wanted it. Washington Monument was, I think, struck by an earthquake in 2011. Cracked right down the middle, metaphor alert. And he, $15 million repair, which is actually not a lot of money for the federal government, but apparently it's too much. Because of our appropriations work, David wrote a check for the other 7.5. So they paid 7.5, David paid 7.5. And he gives this interview, to 60 Minutes, in which he says, government just doesn't have the resources. It used to have. People have to step up. And this is where you're going to reconsider your that's nice, maybe. It turns out, if you have an internet connection, that David Rubenstein is also, in addition to his patriotic philanthropy and government sugar daddy behavior, is also one of the people who is responsible for the government not having a lot of money. David was one of the architects of the carried interest loophole, lobbied for it, fought for it, his firm lobbied for it, his industry lobbied for it. This is the famous loophole that allows people in finance to pay a lower tax rate than their secretaries, as Warren Buffett famously put it. Fought for that. Turns out that costs the government $18 billion a year. So what David is responsible for taking out of government coffers would be enough to repair the Washington Monument 12,000 times per year. And I think if you just think about the full loop of that one man, you understand what I'm critiquing in our age. Chronologically, what happened first was making a lot of money and lobbying for the government to not tax it at the same rate that most people in this room are taxed. Second, you have a lot of money now, the government doesn't have any, and you step in, right? And you sugar daddy the government or whatever cause, you're filling the gap, you're stepping up, you're helping. Third, you reap this reputational blow for having solving the problem that you helped cause. And fourth, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, you actually become a thought leader. Capital T, capital L. On that issue. So David, I first came across him because he bought, I think he must have bought a copy of the 13th Amendment. For other people, sugar daddy. Yeah, this copy, people, you buy an IKEA print, you open the back, it's like, oh my God, someone left the 13th Amendment. So he bought it and donated it to the National Archives or something, right? And he is at the Aspen Institute, where he donates and gets a lot of credit for being a patriotic philanthropist. Giving a lecture, the opening lecture, if I remember correctly, opening lecture of this Aspen conference is David Rubenstein's thoughts on emancipation. Oh yes. And there were many, many, many thoughts. It's like emansplaining, you could say. Emancipation. And so he emansplained for, I don't know, half an hour, just like explaining his thoughts. And that's the full loop, right? You cause the problem, you fix it, you get this reputational flow, and now actually you're the expert on the emancipation of slaves. Because you sort of slightly solved the problem that you massively caused.
Yeah, no,
Don't tell me he's one of your donors.
no, he's not, wow, it's hard to follow that up.
If only he were here, he'd be happy to talk about any amendment you guys want. You just name a number. Even if it hasn't been written yet, he'll tell you.
I'm sure he is an expert in thought leader on all topics. Okay, but we have given the American public a fair amount of reason to buy the story that government can't get the job done. And as much as I would agree with you that the rules of the game have been rigged, we actually still have a pretty large budget for federal, state, and local government. And we are not necessarily creating experiences for the American people that make them feel great about this institution. So I mentioned earlier that we work in food stamps, and that there was an application that took a long time and didn't work and was very frustrating to people. By the way, it's also very demeaning to people who are looking for food stamps. There's a sort of emotional element to how we interact with people who have the unfortunate necessity of dealing with our government. That says, we think you're a criminal, we think you are a fraudster, that is super unfortunate. And I gotta say, there's certainly a lot of ways in which the rules of the game have been rigged to do that too, but I think that's also cultural. But there are 3 online applications in the state of California that will accept your application for food stamps. Just one of them cost $800 million to build, and we pay $80 million a year to maintain it. So I'm not entirely sold on the notion that just giving government more money, though I do believe we are rigging the rules to starve government of money, is going to solve the problem until we change the rules of government.
I fully agree with you. And nowhere in the book do I say the government as it is is the answer. I believe that one of the arguments in the book is we have to change where we go to change the world. But that is a 2-part thing. For average people or elites or whoever else, my advice is if you see a problem, instead of starting a cupcake company that gives back, or a tech company that you just claim is going to solve human problems just by being profitable, actually think of a solution that is public, democratic, institutional, and universal. That's one half of the equation. The other half, in the great reformist tradition of Theodore Roosevelt and Republicans like John McCain, which is, I think, an idea that actually we would get more of if we had a sensible right. This is an area where the right actually has some insight, not this right, but the right in general, which is like leaner, more efficient, responsive government is part and parcel of doing more stuff in government. And I think that's something where, frankly, there's some blind spot on the left, right? The best way to make the case for government doing more stuff is for what government is already doing to be really good. And some government functions like the DMV, I think in too many of our imaginations it's all the DMV. The problem is, like you take the SEC, it's a really high-functioning institution. Unfortunately, none of us really know what it does. And what it does is, like, none of you ever bought a stock that turned out to not actually, like, none of you wired money to a bank that, like, turned out not to be a bank. That happens in many countries in the world. It just doesn't happen here at all, ever. And the SEC makes sure that doesn't happen.
Let's talk about the FDA.
Anything the government does well goes into a category of I'm not grateful for anymore. Like, there used to be antifreeze in medicine. Now there isn't. But, like, it's not rational to sit here and be like, God, there's no antifreeze in medicine. It's exhausting to be grateful for all the things that we've solved. But it's a matter of intellect. We got to remember, even under Donald Trump, the government of this country, the governments of this country, are extraordinary, do amazing work. Like, you don't get sick eating out in this country. I go to many countries where you get sick every time you eat out, right? Like, that is a massive civilizational accomplishment that we just put in a category of like, take it for granted. Like, it takes so, you just take that example for a second.
And by the way, I wrote a little review of both Anand's book, Mariana Mazzucato's book, and Michael Lewis's The Fifth Risk. If you want to feel that wonderful feeling of gratitude for what government does for you that you don't think about any day, and then feel really freaking scared about what's going to happen as those functions degrade over time, read that book. It's a great compliment to Anand's book.
And if you just think about, I think he's focusing on these federal civil servant jobs. You think about the food thing for a second. If you actually, and we're just thinking one little thing in a biopsy, but if you think about what goes into making that work, it's actually so many things. It's not just the obvious, it's just the inspectors, city inspectors, and all that, right? But then it's also like the whistleblower protections that those workers have. And then it's like contract law, right? Which is like really, really good in this country, and no one cares, but it's really very, very good here. And you remember if those restaurants are mistreated or there wasn't really a rat there, there's some remedy. Otherwise, you get chaos. And like, we have this great court system at every level that's just allowing, that's just providing a certain level of honesty.
Okay, that's another place where we might slightly disagree, but yeah, keep going.
I'm talking about relative, like, I travel a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about like relative to the standards of humanity or the standards of history. And I just think, yeah, we gotta make government better and we gotta get money out of it. We have to, and I think, again, like going back to the point about the right, I think there's a place for interesting ideas that have generally been more on the right, like getting rid of 3% of regulations a year.
Yeah.
Because as long as you're adding good new ones, there's probably some weird sedition regulation from the 19th century that we don't need anymore. But there are some reformist ideas on both sides that we need to do more of. Making government worthy is a big part of it, but we cannot ignore the context of coming out of a 40-year war against government.
I completely agree, and I'm so grateful to you for raising that and giving it such voice, and it hasn't had the voice. I think that's why so many of us read the book and just spoke to our hearts. Elizabeth would like us, thank you, Elizabeth, to move to questions. I'm going to ask, so you're all on notice that you're up next, but I'm going to ask you one more hard question, because you just said context. Some of the context today is that we have really freaking urgent issues. Really urgent issues at hand. Some of them, of course, are inequality, some of them are climate. And people don't believe that government can move at the speed that it needs to move to address those issues as fast as they need to be addressed. And part of it is because the political process, the process that says we're going to do this together, we're going to collectively decide how we want to spend our money, how we're going to address these issues, is slow. It is inherently slow to get consensus and agreement. And while I really value that, I live in that space of the tension between the slowness of the political process and the urgency of the issues that face us today. How would you address that concern, especially when it feeds that sense that we really do need to give over our power to oligarchs because they can do shit fast?
Doing the wrong thing fast is not an unmitigated virtue. But I think you raise a and climate change is the most important example of what you're talking about.
Government ain't doing a lot on that front, and we're going to fry.
Correct. Love the carbon tax. So I think, to use a different metaphor, a lot of what I talk about is you can't put a Band-Aid on cancer. And I think what you're raising is, there's bleeding right now. What do we do right now? And none of what I'm saying is don't do the immediate thing. I think the interesting question becomes, if you're on an issue like that, where there's the immediate need, and you're kind of woke enough to say, I want to create system change, to think about ways of doing that giving that addresses the immediate need, the Band-Aid part, and helps treat the cancer. And there are other ways of giving that just apply the Band-Aid, but do not at all improve. So let's take the example of climate change, and let's say Michael Bloomberg. Bloomberg is very good on this issue, as far as I'm concerned.
He's your mayor.
Not anymore, but he used to be,
Oh, yes.
and made the fancy part of our city fancier. And so he's right on this issue, as far as I'm concerned. And he basically has the view that you expressed, which is like the government's not going to do anything now. Trump, so we got to get it together, and I'm going to fund all this stuff. Now, Michael Bloomberg is someone who's particularly insensitive to the kind of arguments I make about participation and democracy. So one of the reasons we have a climate problem in the world is because the percentage of Americans who are dumb on this issue. They don't get good enough education, or they're, college-educated people in this country have a very different view of climate change than people who aren't. So there's a lot of systemic issues that feed into our climate problem, which becomes the world's climate problem because we're the leaders on funding it, fixing it, causing it, etc. So Howard Bloomberg, there's probably ways to do it that just involve, getting companies to do voluntary things or getting state, that's fine. But what if you directed some part of those efforts to try to address the underlying conditions that are causing the problem? What if there was a big training, like training people to run for office component on climate issues, actually developing community solutions to those, so that 10 years from now, you haven't only helped arrest climate change, but you've actually also made this country more civically capable of solving these problems. And my argument is that is a possible kind of giving, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't occur to someone like him. Because for someone like him, the right thing to do, the thing that he thinks is the thing to do, is often all that matters. And the secondary thing about increasing the public's capacity to solve its own problems is just not as close to the heart. And so I think in many of these ways it's possible to do the Band-Aid and be a compassionate person and respond right now, but to do so with a view to making us self-governed.
Yeah, self-governed, great, thank you. So we'll have, how much more time do we have, Elizabeth?
15 minutes.
About 15 minutes. So next up are your questions. Who's first?